Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Very pleased about our guest today. We have Professor Jason Hill, philosophy professor at DePaul University, senior scholar at the Atlas Society, author of 5 books, his latest book being What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Racial Justice in the Age of Post-Oppression. And frankly, one of my favorite people in the movement. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Hill.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, I know from a little bit of your background, we've talked before that you're from Jamaica, and I think I heard you say that you got into Rand before coming to the U.S. Can you give us just a little bit of detail on how you found Rand?
Right. So I left Jamaica in 1985 at the age of 20, and I'd been working as a journalist and had an investigative journalist, and had decided to do a PhD. I hadn't yet decided whether it was going to be in philosophy or probably literature, but I was coming to America to get a college education, to be a journalist and to write books. Basically, I had novels. I thought I'd write novels and basic nonfiction books. And I'd been writing what I, in retrospectively speaking, was some mediocre poetry, but they had the word ego and I. And a friend of mine said, you should read, it sounds like a lot like Rand, and I'd never heard of Rand. So another friend of mine with whom I went to school had a lot of books by Rand. And I showed her the poems and she said, you've got to read Rand. So she gave me The Fountainhead. She gave me Atlas Shrugged, and she gave me The Romantic Manifesto and Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. I started The Fountainhead and I did not like it. I found Howard Roark. I subsequently, of course, came to love it, as I came to love all her novels, but I found the character of Roark a little bit too abstract, a little bit too sort of like born from the head of Athena, born from the head of Zeus. I didn't find a kind of moral psychology there as to how he got to the state of equanimity and almost Zen-like calmness. And so I turned to the Romantic Manifesto, which I was completely floored by at the age of 20. I've been reading a lot of philosophy before then. And then I turned to Objectivist Epistemology, which my mind just went into a zillion directions. I hadn't yet fully discovered Aristotle. And then I read The Fountainhead, and en route to America, I read Atlas Shrugged. It was on the plane that I decided I'm going to do a PhD in philosophy. It felt like a vocational calling, and the best within Rand spoke to me. Her sense of life, the heroism of the characters, the lucidity of thought, but most importantly, I mean, I'd been reading Dickens and Dostoevsky and the Bronte sisters, and ever since I was about 6, because in Jamaica you start school very, very early, and you start high school at 10 or 11, real high school. Wow. So I'd been reading a lot of literature, and I discovered Bertrand Russell before reading Ayn Rand, and snippets of Nietzsche and Immanuel Kant, and some Plato that my father had given to me. But Rand gave me a sort of method of cognition, of thinking in terms of unifying fundamental principles that can tie a set of concretes that are seemingly disparate concretes together on the unifying fundamental principles. And that was a great gift. And so I came to America and then, of course, went to college and did a double major in literature and philosophy, and then went on to do my PhD, won a scholarship to do my PhD at Purdue in philosophy.
Okay. I mean, I'm just a couple of years younger. I got into Rand around 1990, and, right after the Cold War, a couple of years after you read her. I mean, it seemed like her ideas were just getting ready to start a new age of reason, and you're here becoming a professor, and just, but then we all kind of watch as academia is taken over by, what we now know as postmodernism, CRT, wokeism. And so that was kind of your experience in the academy somewhat?
Oh, well, the minute I got into the academy, I started college pretty late at 22, and because I worked in banking to save up money to buy a car and for my school fees. And but I got into college in around 1986, 87. And I saw the signs. I saw what the first thing I saw was the abject moral relativism that was running amok in the universities, where every village idiot wanted to elevate his sophomoric high school opinions to the level of knowledge, and teachers would not fully employ the criteria that we use to adjudicate among truth claims. I saw the burgeoning of relativism really, really seeping into the classroom. There was still some kind of rigor. There was still, because I was schooled in hardcore analytic philosophy, not the continental school. And so there was still an emphasis on logic, but this was also a time when Jesse Jackson was marching around with Black students saying, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. And I remember saying, oh, please give me, I just want 20 years in university where I can have an old-fashioned role as a professor. And I got around 24 out of 25. I've been doing it 25 years now. But I saw the signs. I mean, the signs were there, where this was the age of DWEMs, dead white European males. And the call as early as 1986 to abolish, I mean, the calls had been before during the 1960s, but started becoming a little bit more virulent around that time to purge syllabi of dead white European males and replace it with, Black thinkers, Chicano thinkers, female thinkers. And there's nothing wrong with amending or adding to the canon, but to sort of like dissolve the canon, which was created by the Western canon predominantly by European males. You can't fudge the history. So I saw the signs back then, and I saw the signs of cancel culture. I saw the signs of wokeism, because it was a sort of dogmatism that was beginning to prevail in the universities under the guise of postmodernism.
Yeah, absolutely. The relativism was almost like a first step where they just wanted to be to have a voice supposedly, but then once they achieved cultural power, that now it's like, oh, we're the only voice, and the relativism's less important to them now that they seem to have cultural supremacy. I'm interested because I know that, speaking of cancel culture, I mean, you got some backlash from your campus for your stance on Israel, for example, first. And I have to say, it's refreshing to hear anyone boldly standing for Israel these days, especially on campus. And you did a piece in 2019 that saying very strongly that Palestinians who are openly calling for the destruction of Israel basically must renounce that as the next steps for peace, or at least considering anything near sovereignty for them. I mean, that's my interpretation of the piece. I'm open to debate it, but can you talk a little bit about what happened?
Well, yes. I mean, I just, I had been really an advocate of Israeli politics and of Israel, the state, for a long, long time. I'd been studying world civilizations from, as far back as I can remember as a hobby. My grandmother was born to a Sephardic Jewish father, but that really had nothing to do with it. My appreciation for Jewish civilization and for Judaism as not just as a religion, but just as a sort of an ethical system in and of itself, was quite profound. So I was very pro-Israel. I think Israel is our alter ego in the Middle East, and really got sick and tired, just as I got sick and tired of the Americophobia. I got sick and tired of the anti-Israel, anti-Semitism directed at Israel. So, but Netanyahu back then vowed if he won another term, he would annex Judea and Samaria. I decided to write an article defending his right to annex Judea and Samaria. And also I grew increasingly tired of the extent to which people were defending the Palestinian Authority, which is a terrorist organization along with Hamas, and defending Palestinians as so-called victims, where I saw them as really war refugees on conquered land. That was in this 1967 Six-Day War, was reconquered and taken back. And so and they also vote, I argued, you're right, I argued in the article that they vote terrorist organizations into power. And I even went further and said that if, after a careful vetting process, this continued, that there are certain Palestinians who vote terrorist organizations should be disenfranchised. They should not be allowed to vote. There is no human right to vote a terrorist organization into power, which is inimical to the interests of Israel. And so there was a great deal of pushback, to say the least. I mean, there were students who took over a whole building, and I was censured by faculty council, a group of faculty members at my university. I think it was called a genocidal war criminal and defender of an apartheid genocidal state, and all sorts of nefarious names. But the manner in which I was censored was illegal because it went against the terms of the university handbook. And so I have a lawsuit against the department, and subsequently I've just been reprimanded by students and colleagues and so on for, holding certain viewpoints. And I think when my last book, not this book, the last book before that, We Have Overcome, came out, it was so radically pro-individualism, pro-capitalism, being self-reliant, that I think a lot of people just took exception to the individualistic thrust, intransigent individualist that I am, and the way it played itself out, and the appreciation of Rand's spirit sort of suffusing that work just rubbed people the wrong way. So I'm sort of like an outlier.
So did Howard Rourke. For me, just seeing, because I mean, honestly, I grew up Jewish, and I'm accused of, my support of Israel is because I'm some tribalist or something, but it's just that same thing. It's like, you need to start with the ones that are openly for the destruction of the other side, and they actually need to change first. But for me, watching, Western reaction to these Palestinian intifadas is where I learned about moral equivalence, and that in a lot of ways, what Rand was talking about, the sanction, it's just like caving to the side that's, more willing to go after your family, basically.
That's right. And, I think Israel is a beacon of light in that dark region of the world, and it's a haven for civil rights, for human rights and for civil rights, and it's a place where gays and lesbians go for refuge in that part of the world. But I also thought that, after the Second Intifada, that the Oslo Accords were neutralized, that anything Israel did to defend itself morally was justifiable when you're dealing with with terrorist organizations. I think Rand was right that in those sorts of societies, rights aren't concerned because they're not respecting the individual rights of Israeli citizens. And they're certainly not respecting the sovereignty and autonomy of Israel to make its laws and determine what takes place in its geographic boundaries. So the Second Intifada, for me, just neutralized the Oslo Accords and took the Arabs who claimed that Judea and Samaria were their indigenous lands, when historically that's just not the case. We have all sorts of anthropological, archaeological data to show that Jews occupied that area predated long before the rise of, or the creation of Islam, to say the least. But the other thing I wanted to say too is that, there is a growing anti-Semitism on college campuses today.
Sure.
That is spearheaded under the guise of anti-Israeli politics. But very few people talk about the fact that I think a lot of it stems from hatred of Israel and hatred of Jewish contributions to world civilization. And people are less likely to admit to themselves even how much of their envy and hatred is predicated on Jewish success, Jewish flourishing, Jewish thriving. And what I would say is Jewish superiority in terms of a civilization. I mean, when you look at various civilizations in the world, and you look at the diasporic people who have survived 3,000 years or more than 3,000 years, it's mind-boggling. And you look at the contributions they've made to Western and to world civilizations. One can just dispassionately, in a sort of disinterested way, make the pronouncement that this is a very, very superior advanced civilization. And I think that just rubs people the wrong way. It incurs envy.
Oh yeah, even using the term superior these days is considered, PC minefield. But to me, it's almost with the Palestinians, it's part of the oppression ideology where your success equals oppression. And so if they're historically marginalized, either the Palestinians or even wokeists can react however they want to the point of even openly advocating the destruction of the other side. Is that part of what makes someone like Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib find alliance with this supposedly secular left?
Well, they find alliance because
they're Democrats.
These seemingly disparate groups all have something in common. They hate reason, they hate the idea of an objective reality, but more importantly, they hate America. So LGBT people have nothing in common with Hamas, yet they're the first, lesbians and gays and bisexuals and the trans and the et cetera, folks claim to be on the side of the Palestinians and claim to be on the side of Hamas when they'd be arrested and sometimes beheaded in those countries, in Gaza and other parts of the Middle East. But I think what unites them is a visceral hatred of America. And so they'd rather join forces with alleged victimized and victim group, who I argue in the article, has suffered because of a kind of ideological malfeasance on their part, their failure to produce an ideology that produces liberty and freedom. Why is it that since the inception of the Palestinian Authority, and before that, the Palestinian, what was it called? Under Arafat's 1964, the Palestinian, what was it called?
I thought the PLO was
PSA?
started around that time.
Yeah, but before it became the PA, the Palestinian Authority, that a lengthy acronym under Arafat in 64, that none of those movements have been able to produce parties or political movements that promote liberty, freedom, free market enterprise, or capitalism, or stress self-reliance. It's all destruction, terrorism, and violence. And so I find that when a group has configured its identity in such a way that the only way that emancipation is possible is through violence, because the alleged monster, or the alleged, in their case, not even alleged, Israel, which is the great oppressor state in their mind, has defanged them, has completely eviscerated them of their dignity, that this is attractive to a lot of people. People want to be on the right side of history. And because they've had a coercive monopoly on the moral grammar of victimization. But I also blame, I must say, Scott, some of the problems on the failure of conservatives, of defenders of liberty and freedom, to stand up, same thing in America, and to proclaim the exceptionalism of Israel, to proclaim the exceptionalism of America, and to show and to stop engaging in apologetics, but to stand up and say, we are superior, and here's why we are superior, and we are better, and here's why we're better, that not all political systems are qualitatively equal, and that the Palestinian Authority is not the moral equivalent of Israel.
Yeah, I agree. I think that a real problem is lack of conservative bravery, of just being silent, to going back to what Rand talks about as the sanction.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't just the Palestinians. Then about a year or so ago, cancel culture comes at you again, this time in the form of a student accusing you of transphobia. And I know that in defending yourself, you said that you were not transphobic, but that you had the audacity to say that trans women shouldn't compete with men, which should be debatable today. But now it's a new basis for a complaint. Can you tell us about that experience a little?
Right. Well, this also, these were statements that students claimed I made, but basically, so I think we got around to talking about biology in a class that I was teaching last year, and I think the students were sort of one or two of them. They were all good students, but one or two were sort of baiting me and saying that biological men can become women. And I said, well, they can't change their chromosomal markers. And someone was saying, well, there are men that they're having babies. And I said, well, let's be careful that when we say men are having babies, it's a biological woman with her reproductive apparatus the apparatus is in place. And it's still a biological woman that it's a trans man. The word trans men should be used with the understanding that we're talking about biological women. So it's still not the case that men can give birth, that no person with an XY chromosome can give birth to a child. And so that led to a lot of, outrage and people taking to Twitter and students, some dropping the class and being very, very upset. But this is the kind of cultural psychosis that we're living under. When we can have a society in which people with the objective markers that designate sex be overlooked, that phenomenon, that fact be overlooked, and political expediency supersedes something like objective reality, which is the chromosomal markers designate sex. But we're going to allow politics and we're going to allow the expediency of the moment to supersede basic facts, and people sort of buy into it. That is the thing about cancel culture, is that it's very Stalinist or it's very collectivist and tyrannical because it has no appreciation of the truth. It wants a set of codified norms, mores, orthodox beliefs that support various political positions or uphold various identities, personal identities at the expense of truth. And that's why it's kind of like a religion.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the tenets is saying that women can have babies. So, you saying, whoa, let's rethink that. That's, that makes you a heretic to the new.
You mean men can have babies? Yeah.
Right.
This is a subject I've done a lot of thinking about as well. Actually, I've written a few things about it also, but I'm not a biologist, although I understand the biological argument you're making and I agree with it. I went to school for literature and writing, so I come at it from a more rhetorical angle. And I think one of the big problems in this debate is a rhetorical issue around the words we use, referring to people who have a sort of gender dysphoria or something like that. I don't think we should be referring to them as trans. That's not the right word. That's not the right prefix. I think really they're just pseudo women or pseudo men. And maybe that's not the best word.
It has a negative connotation.
It has a negative connotation, but if you look at it from just like a technical or literal view of the word, they're pretending to be women or men. And so I think we need to change the language we use or change the rhetoric. Otherwise, we're not going to solve this problem, because the people who believe you can change your sex, they're not interested in biology. I don't think we're going to convince them of anything if we make biological arguments. We need to make other arguments. So I propose changing the word.
Okay.
I couldn't agree with you more. I do think that something like pseudo women or pseudo men might capture the reality of the phenomenon. I'm caught in a dilemma here because I'm very wary of using terms that also eviscerate or could tend to eviscerate people of their dignity. And a very, 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 very small percentage of people who suffer from gender or who have gender dysphoria. Clearly, a lot of them are suffering from the and it's a disorder or it's a whatever it is,
Right. Whatever
condition,
it is
a condition that they have. But I think we have to change the vocabulary. I think I agree with you completely. We have to change the narrative. We have to change the labelings, and we have to change the linguistic designators, of course, that we use, because anything short of that is just still playing within the parameters of what I think Rand would call anti-concepts that don't really designate anything in reality. Because you can claim to be non-binary and claim to be trans and still be not taking, and still do not take testosterone suppressors. And society is expected to adhere to the fact that you're now a woman, a trans woman, because you've just made the declaration that you are. And also, we have no way of parsing out who's really suffering from gender dysphoria and who's just on a kick. So I think a lot of this is just faddish, and people are sort of suffering from a lot of psychological problems and think that if they identify as the opposite sex, or that these problems will dissipate over time. And this is clearly not the case, because I'm just shocked that in such a short period of time, 2 years, we have so many people who are suddenly trans. So yeah,
their goal seems to have been to make you a pariah by just coming after you over and over again. 20 years ago, I heard Democrats accuse Colin Powell and Condi Rice or Clarence Thomas of being house slaves or Uncle Toms, and anytime they bucked the party narrative. And I'm curious if you see that same pattern where maybe people who are Black or Hispanic that stray from the liberal orthodoxy, they become almost bigger targets for fire, almost to make an example of them.
I think that's true, although I think they're growing weary. The progressive left is growing weary of these tactics for a couple of reasons. Black people with self-esteem, such as myself, who are individualists, just again regard those sorts of comments as sophomoric high school opinions or pitiful gestures of desperate people who emit emotional vibrations instead of arguments, and we just don't really take them seriously. It doesn't have a single effect on us in terms of shutting us down, and so we don't really care about what people say about us, because in some sense that would be, to use Rand's term, to give sort of metaphysical significance to their conceptual inanities. But I do think that you're right, that Blacks or people of color in general who deviate from that sort of left-wing orthodoxy are bigger targets for criticism. No, they don't use the word house slave anymore. They use the term the blackface of white supremacy or something like that. So they've upped the ante a little bit more. That
they're going to supercharge the language.
They're going to supercharge the language. Yes.
You're a mass murderer. I also think that there's a lesson for virtue signalers, because, for all the progressive talk about caring about historically marginalized groups, but in reality, someone like you can be Black, gay, and immigrant, but if you declare independence from the woke party line too loudly, they're still going to cook up some excuse to call you a bigot anyway.
They are, and that's because their motivation is not to get at the truth. Their motivation is to get at the discrediting of an individual by all means necessary. These people are after power, and they do so because by various processes of practicing nihilism and personal attacks and destruction of the destruction of the character and the credibility of a person by smearing them, and also by default, in this case, appropriating their agency by speaking for them, by psychologizing them, by attributing all sorts of ill motives to them. And they're not getting away with it, at least not with me and other people, because we have very, very loud voices. We're very, very intransigent individualists. We're very proud of our convictions that I think are based in reality. And And that's going to be our biggest weapon, is to not just not be silent, but to speak truth to reason and to logic. And once that's done in a consistent manner, without apology, done just calmly, quietly, but with deadly force, in terms of consistency, and without wavering and yielding 1 inch to the adversary. And I think over time, if enough of us do that, then we'll wear them down, and we'll sort of, the hope is that we'll wear them down, because it's like confronting the schoolyard bully. When you clobber him enough, he ceases picking on you. And these people are bullies. They're not really, in one sense, they're to be taken seriously because they can destroy people's lives. But in another sense, they don't function with the same invariability as do the laws of nature. They can be changed and they can be broken.
It's good stuff. I'm curious if you think there's a kind of place in the liberty movement. I mean, maybe it's already starting to happen, of just getting together and defending academics and intellectuals that are unfairly maligned by cancel culture.
Well, I think there's some room for that, but I think that my experience is that a lot of people, good people, who I've met in academia, who do not agree with this kind of cancel culture and woke supremacists, and I've met them, and they're good people, but they're not terribly brave people. Sure. And so defending them is one thing, but these individuals having the courage of their conviction and standing up and speaking out, I have not seen forthcoming in large numbers, partly I think because they are afraid of ostracism, and they are afraid of the loss of a community that they have spent many, many years building in the academy, with a lot of people who are corrupt and evil and nefarious in many ways. But I think one should continue to do that with the hope that with enough encouragement, with enough support, that these gestures will act as catalysts in moving people who might otherwise remain silent into action. There is a mass support of people who are dissenters within the academy, who are not very, very vocal in their dissent, that with a large support of strength. And we see this coming out in the heterodox movement by Jonathan Haidt. Right. And we see it in other small movements where finally some professors are standing up and saying, no more, I won't take this. But academics by nature are, they like to create havoc in certain respects conceptually, but are not very confrontational right. when dealing with their adversaries.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe some sort of group might help them feel bolder and stiffening their spine a little bit. But I'm curious.
Let me step in. I have a question about the cancel culture. It strikes me that a lot of the cancel culture seems to resemble the battle against Western civilization or whiteness, white culture. Do you think that what we're seeing with the cancelers is that like little bits and pieces of a broader goal to just eliminate Western civilization itself?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I deal with this in the 4th chapter of my new book, What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Racial Justice in the Age of Post-Oppression, where I talk about them as being the new abolitionists in reverse. That is, there's one chapter where I talk about cancel culture being embodied by nihilists who want to abolish whiteness. We hear this term all the time, that in order to deal with the ravages of white privilege, it's whiteness that has to be abolished. And I go into great detail examining the works of writers who advance this idea that really the idea that I show in the book is that Black freedom, according to these people, is inextricably linked to white annihilation, that white people have to annihilate themselves for Blacks to be free, which is tied to a larger idea that it is white people who primarily created Western civilization, And it's white people who are the gatekeepers of an oppressive, evil Western civilization, according to these people who have kept Blacks and others outside the domain of the ethical, outside the pantheon of the human community, wherein this is quite the opposite. Western civilization, of course, as we know, is continuously widening the pantheon of the human community and the ethical, the domain of the ethical, to include rocks and plants and trees and all sorts of inanimate objects that will have their day in court, including trees. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's first meant to erase history, because if you erase history, you don't have the sort of traditional codified phenomena and that have helped us to that function as inoculants, and that we use to inoculate ourselves against attacks. You cancel history, you cancel the principles, you cancel the foundational, the bedrock principles that give our political identities some kind of heft, and give our country, the United States of America, that's based on individualism and private property. You eradicate all those kinds of things, then you start eradicating agency. And you attack Western civilization by criminalizing, of course, its foundational, the parts of Western civilization that are conducive to freedom, that are, you start criminalizing those, of course, reason, logic, objective reality, the idea of truth. And then you've left people conceptually paralyzed, cognitively hijacked, and you can usher in, you can radically change the political DNA, which is what I think these cancel culture practitioners are after. You change the political DNA of this country and you usher in a radically new political system, which I think is Marxist communism and socialism. And so that's a really good way of putting it, that it's really not just canceling. That's a service interpretation, that it's canceling sort of like received wisdom on the left, or, you know, a set of codified norms that we have bought into, which is a form of psychosis that is like men can become women and women can become men, that sort of thing. But a deeper analysis shows that it's really, really an attempt to erase the foundations of Western civilization. And you see this in the attack on our First Amendment, that the First Amendment is seen by a lot of college students as something that has to go or has to be modified radically, because the First Amendment is used to frame debates and to linguistically order society in such a way that keeps minorities and outside on the periphery or on the margins of society. So that's a really great way of putting it.
Yeah, I have been reading your new book, and there's a lot in it that I agree with. And one of the things I agree with is this idea that the practitioners of critical race theory and the cancel culture, there's a connection there, not only to Marxism, but a deeper hatred of everything Western, it seems like. And one thing you say in the book is, you say, quote, "The abolition of whiteness sloganeering that accompanies much of critical race theory's normative agenda is a euphemistic way of telling white people to terminate their lives." And one thing I like about your book is that you go into the psychology of all of these like philosophies and agendas. And I think that's some powerful propaganda that the left has, is they're not just trying to argue that we should abolish Western civilization or get rid of whiteness. They're saying at a psychological level, white man, you should die. You should just destroy your life.
That's right.
And that's, I mean, how do you combat that? I mean, they're basically just murderers.
Right. Well, first of all, I think you know, white individuals just have to show up the sort of nefarious psychosis, magical thinking behind, which shows an arrested psychological development that is more belongs to children, belongs more to children than it belongs to adult, that sort of arrested development. but also, as I've said, we're all privileged in certain ways. I mean, I have 5 college degrees, if you count my associate degree, so I have educational privilege. Some people have beauty privilege. Some people have athletic. I mean, I'm not the athletic equal of my countryman, Usain Bolt, who's I think still the fastest man in the world.
Right.
Not people are equal, we're not all equally intelligent, right? So I tend to think that if we find ourselves privileged, that we count it as a blessing and that we exercise it, so long as we don't use that privilege to eviscerate people of their dignity and destroy their agency. So the best thing I think white people can do is to say, we're not going anywhere, we're here, and to really use logic and reason to show the malice and the kind of psychological disturbance that is at work for any number of thinkers, whether they call themselves Black nihilists or Afro-pessimists, as these people call themselves, that there's a psychological disturbance that is in place for one to predicate one's freedom on the destruction of another set of individuals who we've classified as a separate race, who are white people. And I think most people realize that that's just an absurd, but it's not absurd because it's being taught in K through 12
Right.
to children, So it's absurd, but it's also quite potent because it's being used as a socializing formulae in many, many ways in our K through 12 systems, educational systems.
Comes from a very deeply self-sacrificial morality or ethic. It almost reminds me of primitive cultures that believe people should sacrifice themselves for society,
Right.
to please the gods, but in this case, we need to please the critical race theorists or the people who are anti-Western.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Another thing in your book is you talk about animism and how animism affected African culture and essentially caused them to not be able to resist European enslavement. Actually, you talk about how slavery was the kind of dominant lifestyle in Africa. There was a master-slave relationship, and that was the way things were. So when the Europeans came, they couldn't resist that as a country. They already believed in master-slave relationships. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about animism and how that caused slavery to become a major problem in Africa.
Well, aside from the fact that 90% of the slave trade was made possible it was facilitated by Africans and Arabs. And Skip Gates made this point in the New York Times many years ago. He thought it was quite tragic. Aside from the fact that Africans, we have this idea that there were Europeans just marching into Africa, kidnapping people. Most of the hostage taking and stuff was done by Africans themselves. But to get to the thing of animism, which is the attribution of a soul to plants, to inanimate objects, and to natural phenomena, the idea here is that, look, I think Rand made this point in her introductory essay to The New Intellectual, that one of the distinguishing features between animals and human beings is that animals are forced to adapt themselves to their backgrounds. And human beings do not adapt themselves, or civilized human beings are not forced to adapt themselves to their background. They adapt their backgrounds to meet their needs, which means that they abstract themselves from nature. They see themselves as being separate from nature, and that nature is something that has to be rapaciously exploited in the proper sense of exploited, that is reshaped and remodified to suit the demands of human survival. And I think Rand gives a great point when there's a heat wave, animals die, or there's a drought, animals die of thirst. What do human beings do? We build dams, or we build air conditioning units. That is, as we progress civilizationally, we learn not to adapt ourselves to our background. The animism, if you believe that every single living object has a soul, and that it's sacred, and that you can't touch it, and that you yourself are part of nature, whether one believes in a God or not, part of Judeo-Christianity advances the view that man is not part of nature, that there is nature and that there is man, because God is separate from nature. And so this belief has allowed Western man, so to speak, to abstract himself from nature, to see nature as something that doesn't necessarily exist as his enemy, but it's certainly something that's conquerable. It's certainly something that he's master of and superior to. And you find in animistic cultures the exact opposite, where one has to placate and seek permission from inanimate objects, or even sentient creatures that one is killing. One identifies with them to such an extent that one seeks permission to kill them. It's a mindset that does not allow one to abstract oneself from nature, and in abstracting oneself from nature, learn how to modify and to reconfigure nature to meet the desires and the vision of human beings. And so because the Africans, I argue, neither had a political ideology that could protect them, they had no sense of individual rights, they had no sense of property rights that could protect them from the onslaught of Europeans. And secondly, because of their own philosophic belief systems, which did not allow them to conquer nature and to exploit nature rapaciously in the proper way that European men certainly did. They were seen by Europeans as indistinguishable from nature, that is just as conquerable as the water buffalo, as the minerals, as the gems, as not separable from nature, but as part of nature, because they themselves had already configured themselves and seen themselves as such. And so I make a very controversial point, not necessarily in the book, but I have in other places, that I think slavery was tragic. I think it was evil and unfortunate, but I think it was inevitable given the arrangements of the Africans in relation to the Europeans, and also given the animistic beliefs that the Africans had, that if you look at civilizations and the basic way in which a lot of civilizations have been formed, it's a war for resources. It's a war for resources. And it's the same thing with the Native Americans in this culture. I don't buy into this idea that we live on stolen lands. No, there was a war for resources. The Native Americans came in second, and they lost the war. And one way of looking at it would be Native Americans are war refugees living on conquered land. So I'm not going to buy into this nonsense that, there's the evil Europeans and the innocent Africans who were conquered. There was a war for resources. The Africans lost. The conquistadors from Spain came to South America, and there was a war for resources, and the indigenous peoples lost. Was it tragic? Was it unfortunate? Is the appropriation of the body of another person a violation of individual rights? You bet you. Yes, but and I'm not sanctioning it in any way. I'm just taking a sort of unsentimental, dispassionate look at how the absence of a philosophic viewpoint or the right philosophy can make you prey, really make you physical prey for another country or another set of people or nation or individuals who have a different philosophic system that equips them to be technologically superior and also equips them to be politically superior. So that's the point that I make in the second chapter.
I think it's undisputable that slavery existed in pretty much every culture. And it's not just Europeans bringing slaves to North America or Africans enslaving other Africans, but this seems to be a historical phenomenon, and it begs the question, is slavery an important aspect of human civilizational development? And I can see that slavery can be necessary in situations where there's no real like monetary system or like division of labor, where you just have this master slave relationship because some people have knowledge and other people don't, and the only way to get things done is through brute force and making them do what you know needs to be done. But then at some level of development, the smart people realize that they're all human beings and they all should be treated a certain way. So then you get theories of individual rights. So it's not clear where I'm going with this, but I think if slavery is a necessary part of human development, then we have to analyze that fact and kind of figure out like where it fits in to the civilizational process. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would be remiss if I said that slavery was a necessary part. I think that quite often what happened was that by default, as a result of slavery, a vast swath of people who were what I described left outside the historical process were brought within the historical process. And when you're brought inside the historical process and you become an epoch-making phenomenon yourself as an individual, to say nothing of a group of people, that could be an offshoot of being enslaved. But I wouldn't, so that happened. And I think we can ostensibly point to a lot of civilizations that have Alexander the Great, Napoleon, whether one is a fan of Napoleon or not. Napoleon brought great modernization and light to parts of Europe that were completely backward and primitive and quite non-developmental in their approach to human existence. Napoleon was a tyrant. So I'm sort of looking at how human development has unfolded under certain conditions of tyranny, and slavery certainly is a condition of tyranny. But I wouldn't want to say that it is an absolutely necessary condition in using necessary in the way that a logician would use necessary, that it has to happen. It's an inexorable fact of reality without which people couldn't develop. I think ostensibly pointing to history and showing how tyrannical conditions, including slavery, including conquest, have led to moral and political maturity among previously oppressed groups is one thing. To then posit it as a normative mandate would be another thing. So I wouldn't want to posit it as a normative mandate and say, because that would be endorsing gross violations of individual rights. I'm probably just more comfortable with pointing to the fact that in the case of chattel slavery, that this is exactly what happened, without going as far as to saying that it should have happened that way. It did happen that way, but I think human beings are quite creative, and I think there are other ways of bringing people within the historical process. Nation building, which people can have disagreements about, it might be one way. I'm not sure how I feel about that anymore, but there are various ways of bringing people outside the historical process, primitive people, so to speak, inside the historical process without subjugating them, without enslaving them. That I think political liberalism is part of that enterprise, where it has brought women and it has brought a lot of groups that were excluded from the domain of the ethical into the pantheon of the human community. And So I don't want to say that it's absolutely necessary. I just think that in the case of chattel slavery, that is exactly what I think did happen. That was quite unfortunate, but probably necessary. But then to sort of make that as some sort of universal prescriptive for human development and human enhancement, I would be reluctant to do that, because then I would be committing myself as an ethicist to a system that would gratuitously violate the rights of individuals.
Do you think
That's a
there's
fair distinction? William, I was going to just, I don't know if you have another question about this, or if we just,
Well, do you mind?
briefly, I want to move on to National Conservatism Conference here pretty soon, but maybe just do one quick follow-up one.
Well, I have one other issue. I just wanted to discuss the Civil Rights Act, because in your book, you also discuss the Civil Rights Act. And I know that Rand had some negative views of the Civil Rights Act. She actually called it like the worst breach of property rights in the sorry record of American history.
Mm-hmm.
But in your book, you make an argument for its necessity. So I was wondering if you could like describe that and how you view Rand's statement in comparison to your views on it.
Well, I think technically Rand was right in that it is a violation of property rights. That is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which I call the third founding of America, because it was the act that brought the promise of 1776 to complete fruition. That is, among other things, granting Blacks full equal standing before the law, erasing a situation which had heretofore existed, that is the creation of laws and punitive laws that punish Blacks because they were Blacks, like miscegenation laws, which clearly is an egregious violation of individual rights, but aimed more specifically at Blacks and well, at whites too, but Blacks suffered, I think, the most under miscegenation laws because they were cast in certain ways that further deprive them of their individual rights. So I think Rand was right that when a state says to an individual, you cannot use your private property as an extension of your living room or as an extension of your identity, and discriminate on the basis of race, that technically that's right. My argument is that rights are contextual in many ways. Like the First Amendment right is not an absolute. You can't commit slander and libel and false advertising and shout fire in a theater in which there is no fire. So given the extent, I argue in the book, to which the state had colluded with white Americans in using property to disenfranchise Blacks, to keep them outside the domain of the human community, to systemically deny them of their rights, their individual rights, given the fact that there were tax-paying Blacks whose taxes were used to finance not just theme parks and recreational parks and libraries, and many forms of life from which Blacks were excluded, but also the railroad, private businesses that whites owned that were contracted by the government. There were all sorts of nefarious ways in which Blacks taxpayers' monies were used to finance white businesses, contracts between the state and local operators that were just horrific. And therefore, it created a culture of racism. The state was the greatest enemy against Black people, not private white citizens, I argue. The state played a role. If you were a hotelier in the 1930s or 40s and you wanted to rent a room to a Black driver a Black traveler in the South, you couldn't do so. You could be arrested because the state had created these heinous laws. So given the fact that the state, since slavery, I argue, had created a climate of discrimination, a climate of then white supremacy when it did exist. I don't think we're a white supremacist country anymore, but we used to be, and it was a state who created that the state was under a moral obligation, given how heinous racism had been and the extent to which it really damaged the agency and the lives of Black people, that this was one trespass on private property that, I know it's a contentious point, that in order to bring Blacks fully into the domain of the ethical, the state had to, because it had colluded with the white population and had produced through processes of socialization, racist socialization. Because I argue, even go further to suggest that there was an affirmative action program for propertied white males at the expense of non-propertied white males, that what Rand properly called the trespass or the violation of property rights were, in this case, justified. But
well, I think, can I just step in real quick and say, I think that there's the old adage, two wrongs don't make a right. Do you believe that we've gone too far in the other direction of trying to rectify past problems, and now we're just causing more problems on the other side and being racist towards whites?
Well, I think that the so-called, well, not the so-called, the actual trespass on property rights, like in the form of affirmative action, should have been something quite temporary, which is not to say I think the 64 Civil Rights Act should be repealed. It's to say that, yes, we have gone, we've gone beyond a certain pale of racism in this country towards Blacks, where I think I would dare say Blacks are the new sacred symbols in this country, where they're treated with kid gloves and everyone wants to bend over backwards to produce Black enhancement and Black productivity and Black uplift. I'd be hard pressed to find a university in America or a corporation whose policies are systemically designed to keep Blacks outside of. It's just not the case anymore. But again, paradoxically, I don't know that we could have gotten to that stage without the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That is, I call it a eugenics moment, a social eugenics movement on the part of the states to re-socialize the sensibilities of whites into making them non-racist. It was the most audacious eugenical moment, I think, in American history. And I think we've gone beyond the pale of racism, that we can sort of stop systemic efforts in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion to prevent what was, I think, temporarily necessary at one time to get the ball rolling, to get Blacks included and mainstreamed and assimilated into society. That goal has been accomplished. And I agree with you that we're going a little bit too far now in the direction where we're directly now penalizing white people, keeping them outside of the sphere of employment, which is a very different phenomenon than saying we just want Blacks to have a good shot at an opportunity of making something good of their lives. But this need not come at the expense of diminution of white people. So that's a difference between a quota system and just like an open affirmative action program, which I don't think is necessary anymore, because we've progressed to a certain level of commitment to rights and the well-being of Blacks and other minorities in this country. That just was not the case 60 years ago or 50 years ago or 55 years ago.
We could do a whole show on that topic. It's fascinating. I do want to switch gears a little bit, just because you spoke at the National Conservatism Conference in Orlando last summer. It's run by Yoram Hazony. And, it's funny because they seem to be the current boogeyman of those in the liberty movement that I think are kind of afraid of the left. They're convinced that the National Conservatives are like new Nazis, or maybe they're just saying that so the left won't call it of them. But I'm just curious if, just to kind of demystify them, if you can tell us a little bit about your talk there, your experiences with the people at the conference.
Well, I think people in an imperfect world, distinctions have to be made, right? And there are two forms of of nationalism. The one is a very nefarious and evil one, which goes by the name of ethnic, sometimes cultural nationalism, like we found under Nazi Germany, under Slobodan Milosevic, where it's predicated on excluding people who don't belong to the state based on criteria of blood, lineage, and native birth or something like that. We saw this in Germany for many years, where Turks who had been born and raised there for many generations, for many decades, were not allowed citizenship until quite recently. And then there's civic nationalism, which we have in the Republic of France, Canada, or Republic, which is citizenship based on a set of thin allegiance to the values around which the Republic is built. So it's a thin allegiance to a set of political values that give the constitutional republic its identity. We find those in the Bill of Rights. We find those in the various amendments of the Constitution. We find that in the concept of inalienability. I find that the National Conservatism movement that I attended is concerned with America losing a part of its political identity. And I mean, you've got Jews there, you've got Christians, you've got people from all walks of life. So it clearly can't be a movement that's trying to somehow endorse or promote cultural homogeneity, because you've got disparate cultural groups there. So my experience is that there are factions within this country, coming from the left mainly, who want to change the political DNA of this culture, of our civilization, I should say, and who want more than nothing else to configure a set of new political values, which can either replace the Constitution that many of them want to abolish, or amend the Constitution politically in ways that would make the United States unrecognizable. And that's what I took from the National Conservatism Conference, that they are conservative in that sense, that they want to preserve the Constitution and preserve the basic values, the foundational values, the bedrock values, which make something like inalienability, individualism, the free market enterprise operable and functional in this country. And also a kind of nationalism that is not exclusionary based on arbitrary phenomena like race and ethnicity. There are all sorts of ethnicities there, and Asian people, and as I said, Jewish people. And the guy who runs it, Yoram, as you pointed out to me, is Jewish, or who's in charge of things. And so I feel that they are very much a part of the movement to keep certain values alive in this country and principles, which are preconditions for individualism. See, part of the problems that I have with some of the libertarian movements is that they just act as if people can be individualists, separate and apart from a kind of milieu in which that individualism is ensconced, and they don't look at the preconditions that make it possible for individualism and the concept of inalienability to continue existing. And I think the National Conservatism Conference really probably place less emphasis on, individualism. It takes individualism for granted, but is more concerned with the preconditions, the values, the principles, without which inalienability and without which something like individualism would be very, very, very hard to practice. Because if we have a socialist country, if we have a totalitarian country in this world, very few of us can be individualists and stay alive. So that's what I took from them.
Okay. But, you know, I mean, again, I think we need to see more alliances within the liberty movement. I think objectivism has suffered from its insularity. And I'm heartened by you joining Atlas Society along with Salzman and others, things like Freedom Fest, where they're getting a lot of these people together. Are you seeing more attempts?
Well, with the Atlas Society, I certainly am seeing, much to my delight, I am seeing something that I respect the Ayn Rand Society. I respect your Brooks quite a bit, and Greg Salmieri. I used to do a lot of work with them and for them and give talks. But one thing I can say about the Atlas Society that is very different from the Ayn Rand Society and is that it is making, and Ayn Rand would probably roll it in her grave, but who cares? I mean, it's an open-ended system, I think, as the Atlas Society advocates, and that she was not infallible, she was quite fallible. So one of the things that I like is that they make overtures to organizations and to groups with which they have things in common, constitutive values that the Atlas Society and other groups share. They may differ in degrees about the application of certain fundamental principles or the importance of emphasizing certain principles over the other, like in the hierarchy of principles, which one should take precedence. They may have disagreements, but they all agree on the fundamentals, as Rand would say. And I think this litmus test that you find in other Ayn Rand organizations, that you have to adhere to these set of dogmas, is completely missing from the Atlas Society, which I appreciate very, very, very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been on a few clubhouse sessions with you, which I enjoy, and I like that you're not afraid to push back even on the other scholars when you disagree, and even Rand when warranted. I wanted to ask you about one thing I heard you talk about. Tell me if I'm repeating this right, but basically that raw attraction could be separated from moral values.
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that Rand believes in love at first sight, but then says that love is a response to values, seems to me problematic, because you don't know, you see someone, you love them, you fall in love with them or you love them, you know nothing about that person's character. You know nothing about that person's, the repertoire of that person's value systems. You know nothing about the characterological makeup of that person. What you're responding to is, it seems to me, lust or something like raw, visceral, brutal, physical attraction that you later on, sort of retrospectively, you make it respectable or you justify it by adding on a set of almost, I don't know, preconceived notions of value that you know affix to the person, that you could in some sense, I don't want to use the word intuit because Rand would use that word, but that you could in some sense perceive even without knowing them, which I think is a crock of bull. I don't know how you can see someone for the first time, love them. I think part of the messiness of the human condition is that we are often attracted to people whose values are quite different from us, from ours. We are attracted to people for many, many reasons. The field of psychology is very, very complicated, and we are attracted to people quite often who bring out the extremes in ourselves that we lack, or the extremes in ourselves that we are afraid of exhibiting. And to somehow just predicate love as a response to values seems to be part of the story, but not fully the story.
Absolutely. Man is a rational animal, but we're still animals. And I think sex drive itself is largely biological in nature, and that doesn't have to invalidate free will, but you shouldn't try to, just not acknowledge it either.
Right, right. This is the thing. Yes, I think in order to make us not seem like farm animals and jungle beasts, we have to somehow, even if it's love at first sight, somehow make it respectable by somehow suggesting that we can perceive certain values in the posture, in the gait, in the, notwithstanding the fact that people are good actors and that people are good poseurs and that people are able to exhibit manifest certain physical traits that are open to a multiplicity of interpretations. Just, you look at the Dominic Franklin, Howard Rourke scenario, and it seems to me, I've read that novel a couple of times, that what Dominic was really responding to was raw, naked lust for someone that she found irresistibly sexually attractive. She knew nothing, objectively speaking, about the values that he held, about the principles that he held, about the nature of his character. And later on, of course, she could ratify the love, or truly ratify the love by ostensibly pointing to the values that he had in his character. But initially, this idea that all love, if we're taking her viewpoint seriously, that there is something called love at first sight, that all love is rooted in a perception and appreciation of another person's values, seems problematic. Yeah.
Sure. And even beyond sex, you mentioned Jonathan Haidt. He and many others have talked about how in a lot of cases there's what you want to do, and then you build up the kind of moral principles around it. That just we have that we like to make it where we're being principled first, but in reality, I mean, we're reacting to what's happening, and in reality, that often ends up happening where you decide you don't like someone, and then you build up the case for them later.
Right.
And that's I'm also as long as we're talking about where we disagree, I think more about genetics has come out since her death that makes tabula rasa seem a little incomplete to me. I think there can be genetic dispositions that don't agree with free will also. But I'm curious. I just want to circle back because we did touch on the objectivist movement, and just you have kind of more of a bird's eye view with the interactions with ARI and even TOS and now TAS. I'm just curious, what's kind of gone right, what's gone wrong, where do you see things going from here?
Well, I think the Ayn Rand Institute is a very respectable scholarly sort of machinery, so to speak, because it does function like it does seem like a well-oiled machine, where they are really aimed at academics. And I think in the division of labor, in the moral division of labor, there are many, many roles that have to be fulfilled. And I think that they are more interested in terms of getting the scholarship right. So there's a little bit more emphasis on dogma, and as it's coming out of Rand's mouth and her texts, and getting the philosophy right, and schooling a set of academics or infiltrating the universities. There are drawbacks to that because I think relying on the infallibility of Ayn Rand on certain topics and then sort of justifying it and trying to defend it at all costs, as opposed to doing what she herself, I think, advocated, which was critical, open inquiry into a viewpoint. Any person's viewpoint would be better served by that attempt. I think Craig Biddle's objectivist standard is, I've given a keynote address for them, and I've done some work with them, is aimed, like the Atlas Society, at very, very young people. And it's similar in terms of the Atlas Society. They produce a wonderful magazine. which is very, very robust and rigorous, and the writing is quite beautiful. They're probably not as geared towards young converts or potential would-be converts as the Atlas Society. I love the Atlas Society because I think the Atlas Society, among other things, is attempting to do a couple of things. It's attempting to meet young people where they are in terms of their limitations, but also inspiring them to climb outside of the immediacy of their positions, and is holding up something like an ideal to which they can aspire. But it's doing it in stages. It's doing it through social media. It's doing it through the language of technology, which they communicate in primarily. And it's almost a wonderful, seductive attempt that they use social media in order to get them to read the big book, like ultimately read the book like Atlas Shrugged. Whereas the Ayn Rand Society will sponsor these high school contests where they just aim at the students to read Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead. That's a self-select few students who are already predisposed towards reading. Whereas I think the Atlas Society is trying to reach a broader swath of individuals, whereas the Ayn Rand Society is trying to reach maybe an already dedicated set of converts and then refine their sensibilities. I could be wrong, or hone their sensibilities. Or to
Yeah, I
reach
mean, I
people.
think that's what they aspire to. I mean, I don't know how, you know, about the track record if we did an objective analysis, but I'm just, you know, I'm about what direction you're moving in, and I see, you know, JAG has been making moves over the year, bringing people like you in and just expanding, working with other groups, and that's just, you know, I'm for alliances and for being open, and so just from that perspective, I'm happier with the direction that things are going in.
Yeah,
I'd like to circle back a little bit to the National Conservatives. I think that it's interesting how what you're saying about the National Conservatives, because most objectivists, I think, especially ones who follow your own book, they're very anti-conservative and have a lot of negative things to say about the right wing. And so I think it's interesting that you're finding ways to work with them and understand their ideas better. Do you think that you yourself have changed in your political views? Because I know you were a big fan of Barack Obama and you voted Democrat, right? I think in elections. And are you leaning now more towards the Republicans, or have you changed your views on that?
not the current Republicans as they stand. They'd have to produce a Republican that was principled, that had a sort of coherent and ethical foreign policy. A Republican who, or Republican leadership, I should say, that did not advocate crony capitalism, as Donald Trump certainly was guilty of. So I feel like a man without a party, so to speak, because I think the Democratic Party that I had previously voted for, I didn't vote in the last elections because I'm still waiting for my ballot. I think some dog got it and voted with his paw. But so I did not vote in the last election. But the Democratic Party is moving so far to the left that I do not recognize it anymore. I used to talk about the far left. Now I just talk about the Democratic Party. So I could not see myself voting Democrat anymore at all.
Yeah.
And I couldn't see myself voting under the current leadership of the Republican Party for the Republicans. So unless some Republican emerges who is principled, who has a consistent foreign policy, who has a domestic policy that is consistent with the free market enterprise, not cronyism. I shouldn't even say crony capitalism, not an advocate of cronyism. And this candidate wouldn't have to be perfect. The party wouldn't have to be perfect, but the party seems to be in shambles. The party itself seems to have lost its commitment to individualism and seems more tribalistic and doing what's based on political, what's in the interest of political expediency. And that is whatever is expedient at the moment, whether it's demonizing immigrants 1 minute, when this country drastically needs immigrants in terms of nurses, doctors, and IT workers, or getting on some other bandwagon along with the left, when they start advocating something positive and pro-freedom, pro-individualism. And when the Republican Party stops cavorting with terrorists like Russia and China, and cyber terrorists, for example, and really realize and take a stance on who are our enemies in the world. But I don't mind using the term conservative, because if we have to use conceptual designators to pinpoint or political orientation, as imperfect as those designators are, I feel most comfortable using the term conservative, because it has more intellectual and conceptual heft than, let's say, a word like libertarian. Because I know many, many libertarians. I know left-wing libertarians, anarcho-libertarians, libertarians of all stripes. And so if I wanted some sort of conceptual specificity, I couldn't use a term. I am a libertarian, broadly speaking, but the term is such a broad, multifarious term that I don't think it captures the same kind of narrowness and specificity as a term like
It's like atheist.
Or atheist, right? Right.
Like, I don't agree with a lot of those guys.
Well, I see conservative as a word that's not going away. So I think we're stuck with conservative and liberal for a while. They've been around for 100 years or so. I think Rand was probably misguided in dropping the label and not fighting for the word, because originally she wanted it to just mean you were a supporter of capitalism. Mm-hmm. And I think that was correct, and she should have stuck to her guns, but instead she, went obituary and said that conservatism was dead, and the religionists have taken over the word. So what do you think about trying to rehabilitate the word conservative and make it mean what we want it to mean?
Well, that's what I've been trying to do. And that's why I always preface by saying I'm an independent conservative. And here's what I mean by conservatism. I think that if more people took a very principled stance to conservatives and show that we are in a cultural war that is designed to destroy the supremacy of the individual, that the individual is a minority, as Rand said, and that when you're in a cultural war, when you're facing cancel culture advocates who want to destroy the Constitution, who want to destroy Western civilization, that the term conservative actually makes moral and political sense in today's world. If we lived in a world in which any of those virtues and any of those institutions were not under attack, then the term conservatism might seem just dated or not necessary, really, because you'd be fighting for things that are existing, and there seem to be no imminent threats against their longevity, but that is not the case. So when someone says, "Why are you a conservative?" It's because I'm conserving. I am about the business of conserving, protecting, maintaining institutions, values, principles that are under attack. And then I go on to name them: the concept of inalienable rights, capitalism, especially individualism. It's so interesting that so few people talk about individualism outside of objectivists. Individualism today, the conservatives don't even talk about, individualism. That term,
they talk about rights, but rarely do they say individual rights. I've
individual rights. That's right. And I've, I like to talk about the fact that we're talking about individual rights here and what that means, going back to Rand. And so I think that with a proper commitment to delineating the constitutive features of conservatism and then tying them to the things within American civilization that are not just worth preserving, but that must be preserved for us to recognize the United States as the United States, and then for us to create the conditions in which individualism and free market enterprise are allowed to thrive, that the moniker conservatism makes really, really good sense.
That's good. Well, that is great. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us, Professor Hill. I'm thrilled to see you at the Atlas Society. I look forward to seeing you on more Clubhouse sessions and for your next information or your next book or essays to come out. And just please keep fighting the good fight. And William, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for coming on. I enjoyed talking to you, and thanks for answering all my questions. I look forward to, I'm halfway through your book now. I'm looking forward to finishing it, and I look forward to reading all your future works as well.
Thanks, William and Scott. It's been a pleasure. I can't believe an hour and a half has gone by so fast.
I know. Well, that's great. Well, this has been the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig, and we will see you next time.